If anyone dares try to test my mental competence, I will eviscerate every single person with my intelligence right now.
Erik Conover is known online for his viral real estate content, but right now he's getting the wrong kind of attention. Police in New Hampshire say the YouTube star hit an officer with his car and kept going, leading law enforcement on a wild chase. But the YouTuber said in court the police have got the wrong guy. We're taking a look at the charges he faces and what he has to say about them. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Erik Conover, also known as Erik Van Conover, has nearly 3 million followers on YouTube, with many of his videos garnering almost 1 million views. And one of his most popular videos, in case you don't know who he is, features him doing a workout with actor Chris Hemsworth. Now, the About section of Conover's channel reads, merging architecture, sacred geometry, and AI consciousness evolution, this channel explores homes built for energetic resonance and human expansion. Here's the problem. The popular vlogger, aspiring actor, he is now in some very hot water in New Hampshire, because that is where Conover is accused of allegedly trying to kill a police officer. Now, Conover said during his first court hearing last weekend that this was all a, quote, massive misunderstanding, and we'll get into that a little bit more. But I am joined right now by trial attorney Adante Pointer. Adante, so good to see you. Thanks so much for coming here on Sidebar. So right off the bat, this is a guy who definitely has clout online. He has followers. People will know who he is. But according to WMUR, during his first court appearance, he apparently even claimed that I'm a public figure, that he's got these millions of subscribers, and that this was some sort of sting against him. Why make a statement like that, Adante? Because I wonder if that's going to hurt him in the long run.
Well, you know, I can see him at this point grasping for straws, as it will, to try to win in the court of public opinion. And when you see these people who have big followings online, oftentimes when they find themselves in hot water, they then claim, well, this is some type of conspiracy against me.
Let me ask you a question. Big status like this, big follower. We talk about this with celebrities. He's not quite a celebrity, but he's well known online. Is that a factor, his status online, is that a factor that could come into this case at all? You go all the way down. Let's say this goes to a trial. Could that be used by the prosecution? Is it something that would only come in if he were to take the stand, for example? You know, even jury selection. You have to wonder if people will know who he is and if that'll affect him. Talk to us about his status, how that could affect the case in any way.
His status certainly can affect the case in a number of different ways, from start to finish. And what I mean by that is, in terms of the way in which it's investigated and looking at his prior statements that he may have made during his podcast or online, if there's something that the prosecution deems to be incriminating as relates to the way in which he relates to police or doesn't like police, or his feeling that he may be above the law, that certainly is something that the prosecution can draw on. And we've seen them do that with cases with celebrities who are like rappers and things like that. They take their prior statements or their art and use it against them. Or you can even see it, for example, in jury selection. It could take a very long time, if you will, to find 12 jurors who are not biased or who are not so familiar with him to where they think that they cannot sit in judgment of him and only judge him based upon the evidence in the court of law versus what they understand about him from his podcast. And going further, I'm sure there's going to be some sparring between the attorneys, the prosecution and the defense, as it relates to what type of evidence actually comes into the trial, as it relates to statements he's made online and or the celebrity of who he is. So this could be one of these cases where everyone has to buckle up. And we've seen that where courthouses are besieged by these influencers, followers, and jurors and court staff feel like they're intimidated by the presence of the public and their followers. And so this could be something that really permeates the trial and can potentially affect its outcome.
I mean, I always ask the celebrity question because I was in that courtroom every day for Johnny Depp, Amber Heard, and you see the mountains of supporters that were there for him in the courtroom. I heard them making comments when people were testifying. Different situation, but I always am fascinated by that. Definitely a crazy situation we're talking about right here. My gosh. And here, let me just say this in general. You got to think about having the right lawyer in your camp if something happens. And that's why I want to call out Morgan & Morgan, our great sponsor and partner. This is a firm with over 1,000 attorneys. You know why? Because they win a lot. In the past few months, Morgan & Morgan secured a $9.3 million verdict for a car crash victim in Florida, $5.6 million for another car accident victim in Atlanta, and not to mention $1.8 million in Kentucky after insurance offered them a mere $5,000 in that case. And even if you think your case isn't worth millions of dollars, why not start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC Sidebar. Okay. So now let me get into, if everybody's wondering what exactly is he accused of doing, what's happening here? Well, now I want to get into what is being reported about Conover's alleged actions over the weekend. So according to reporting from the Conway Daily, Conover was driving in Bartlett, New Hampshire on Saturday. And a Bartlett police officer, who was apparently dealing with another traffic stop, allegedly estimated visually that Conover was going between 55 and 60 miles an hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. According to testimony in court, Conover's during this first hearing, the officer, Cameron Emmett, apparently chased after this Jeep and managed to get Conover to stop. So Police Sergeant Brian Moffat told the judge what allegedly happened next. Quote, while Officer Emmett exited his vehicle, he moved around to the rear of his cruiser, and you, Mr. Conover, then backed his vehicle rapidly, pointed it directly at Officer Emmett, and accelerated at him, striking him at a reasonably high rate of speed. So according to the sergeant, the officer actually was on the hood of this car and then was thrown in the air, thrown 20 to 40 feet away. Apparently he had to go to the hospital. Now, fortunately, his injuries were not life-threatening and he's since been released, but quite the scene. Now, meantime, Conover allegedly took off, according to WMUR, going another 28 miles before other officers were able to stop him. Apparently, multiple agencies were called in to help this situation, and the New Hampshire State Police apparently had to set up spike strips to stop him. This is according to reporting from Conway Daily. So right now he's charged with attempted murder, first-degree assault against a police officer, second-degree assault, reckless conduct with a deadly weapon, disobeying an officer, and reckless driving. So Adante, they hit him with so many different charges here. Talk to me about attempted murder. Is attempted murder hard to prove here?
Well, if the deputy's recount of what took place stands and isn't controverted by some other evidence or testimony, for example, like body cam or dash cam from the car, then yes, it's not going to be terribly hard for them to get an attempted murder charge. Look, if this person could clearly see that the officer is standing in front of the car, sees the officer clinging to the hood, accelerates at him at, they say, a reasonable rate of speed, well, clearly it must have been fast enough to when he hit the brakes or swerved that the officer went 20 feet, according to what the fellow officer said. That means that car was going at an extremely high rate of speed, in my opinion, based upon what I've seen in other incidents. And that in and of itself shows a reckless disregard and an idea that you're intentionally speeding at an officer, putting his life in danger, and then you even sent him to the hospital for those injuries. So I think that'll be a pretty good case for the prosecution, and it'll be a tougher case for the defendant to try to wiggle his way out of.
I want to ask you about the different charges that he's facing. Attempted murder, right, top charge, may be tough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but then do you have all of these other alleged crimes that it would be easier for a jury to convict him on, let's say, first-degree assault against the police officer or second-degree assault? In other words, if we can't convince a jury of the murder charge or the attempted murder charge, these are crimes that are catch-alls, they're lesser included, they're easier to prove. Is that why you see so many different charges levied against him right now?
You often see prosecutors bring a number of different charges, starting with the most extreme or the most severe, as you mentioned, like in this case, an attempted murder. But they also have what you termed, and what I understand it to be as an attorney, lesser included, meaning charges that are a part or lead up to an attempted murder, but don't require the same level of evidence or of certainty. And so it's much easier charge for a prosecutor to prove than the big enchilada here, which is attempted murder. So it allows a jury, if they aren't willing to go to the extreme of saying, hey, we think that he intended to try to kill this officer, a jury can then rest their verdict of saying, well, even though we don't think he tried to kill the officer, he still acted in a way to assault or batter the officer, and those still carry substantial amounts of jail time. Not as much as attempted murder, but it's still looking at a prison sentence.
I thought this was interesting. The sergeant also testified in court, quote, "We're very fortunate that an amateur drone operator was in the air when he saw the interaction and was able to capture it on video." So Adante, whether it's drone footage or dash cam footage or body cam, that's got to be a critical piece of evidence. And that can come in, right? That can come in as a piece of evidence, the drone footage?
The drone footage is going to be a critical piece of evidence in this case, and perhaps at trial if it should go that far. Because video evidence, be it from a body cam, be it from a dash cam, or be it from a drone of a third party who wasn't a part of what was taking place, it doesn't lie, meaning it doesn't have a bias. It's not for the police. It doesn't have a bias against our influencer. Instead, it's just going to show you what took place. It doesn't mean that there won't be a heavy and substantial debate as it relates to the accuracy of the footage and from its viewpoint, what it showed and what it didn't show. But that'll be up for the attorneys to spar about. But that will still nevertheless be a critical item of evidence in this case.
And how it was handled, how it came into evidence, that's always a critical point for defense attorneys, right? How was it authenticated properly? Was it mishandled? Was it altered in any way? Those are conversations that come up, right?
Sure. In a criminal case, when you have footage or any type of physical evidence, you're going to see the defense attorney pounce at any opportunity they have to try to undermine the credibility of that evidence, be it the chain of custody, how do they obtain it, how do they preserve it, and how has it been altered in any way in terms of slowing it up, speeding it up, or magnifying it. So, I'd expect that to be ripe grounds for a lot of challenges from the defense attorney.
Talking about defense, this is where things take a turn. So during his arraignment, Conover apparently told the judge that the police reports about the incident were falsified, that they're not real, that they're not accurate. So he tried to tell the judge that he was not the Erik Conover they were looking for because he was from New York City, while the Erik Conover that they were hunting was from Absecon, New Jersey. So according to his Wikipedia page, Conover was born and raised in Absecon. Now, Adante, first thing I thought was, very my cousin Vinny, right? Two different men, same car, same time, but I mean, look, I'm just getting to this case the same way you are. I'm looking at it the same way. I'm thrown into it. That's an interesting defense. I'm curious how he'll be able to show that if that's the way he and his attorney ultimately move forward with it.
Yeah, it appears to me when I heard that comment, but yet we can just simply do a Wikipedia search and see that he spent some time in the city that he is now trying to disavow as identifying him. It appeared to be the type of comments of someone who is off their rocker, perhaps is not in the best mental state. It didn't appear like he gave that statement with the advice and consent of his attorney, because any attorney worth their salt would have hushed their client up and said, you're not going to say anything right now because you're not going to go against your Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination. So I don't think that was with the advice of counsel. And frankly, the question is going to be, can they admit that to show that he is as an indication of guilt in terms of him trying to disavow himself from something that's easily proven. So that could become a problem for him later on in the case.
Something you said very critical about mental health. So Conover was apparently very vocal during his arraignment, basically saying that New Hampshire state troopers, quote, brutalized him and that he was being treated, quote, like an animal in jail. And then there's this.
If anyone dares try to test my mental competence, I will eviscerate every single person with my intelligence right now. And that's not being egotistical.
Okay, Adante, that's quite the statement. Mental health issue at play? Mental health defense possibly at play?
That's an ill-advised statement, in my opinion, one that probably was not given with the advice and consent of his attorney, and one that may actually play towards helping him, even though if he might fight it, to show, look, right now he has some competency issues. He's going through a mental health crisis, and this is exhibit A of that in terms of this statement. It's pretty strident, and frankly, if his attorney thinks that he is suffering from some type of mental defect, it's incumbent upon that attorney and probably has a duty under the law to make sure that that's evaluated and investigated, because that could aid in his defense for these charges.
Going back to these charges and going back to a jury, if you have a victim who is a member of law enforcement and you have the testimony of law enforcement, in your sense, your experience, do you feel that juries will give more deference to the officers in this kind of case, their testimony, their observations, particularly, let's say, the victim, the alleged victim in this case, testifies. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I've tried many cases. I've had cases wherein police claim to be a victim or police are witnesses in those cases. And oftentimes we give an admonition or an instruction to the jury as it relates to how to evaluate police testimony. You're not to give an officer more credibility or to place more weight on their testimony simply because they're a police officer. The reason why those instructions are often given to the jury, because almost as a natural reflex to watching and hearing and listening to an officer on the stand, jurors give officer testimony a lot of weight. And it's a hard road to climb for a defense attorney when they're challenging an officer's testimony. You have to have something that's objectively can be verified to show that the officer was lying or kind of shading the truth. And without that type of objective evidence, juries oftentimes admit and accept an officer's testimony with very little scrutiny.
Could the officer sue Conover for his injuries? I mean, anybody can sue anybody for anything, but it just becomes if it's a viable lawsuit. If he does decide to take legal action against Conover, what would you expect to see? Because at the time of this recording, I wasn't able to see any pending lawsuit, but do you think that that is a realistic possibility here? Especially, by the way, I don't know how much he'd be making on social media, but 3 million subscribers, million views, you could be making some significant money, and not sure what Conover does for the rest of his time, but you have to wonder whether or not a lawsuit could be on the horizon.
I certainly expect the police officer victim here to evaluate all his legal options to figure out if he could bring a lawsuit against Conover for his injuries and what took place. Conover has a substantial social media following. You'd expect that he's being paid pretty handsomely for his YouTube following. And with that being said, the officers would and could be looking at him to compensate him for the injuries he sustained. Of course, most states have workers' compensation laws. And so it may be a situation where the officer is only able to recover or to be paid and compensated for his injuries through the state. However, if there is a legal option for the officer to bring a lawsuit against Conover for the injuries sustained, expect that to happen, especially if there's a conviction here.
That's a good point. By the way, this apparently, based on the reporting, wasn't Mr. Conover's first run-in with police this month. No, just a few days before this incident, where he allegedly tried to run over an officer, Conover was arrested for DWI. And it appears he was released after that arrest because he allegedly posted a photo on his Instagram page showing bruises on his wrist with a caption that said, "Ouch, cuffed up." Didn't provide any other details, but in court, Conover denied that he was driving drunk, saying that he has been sober for more than 1,000 days, but he's still facing that DWI charge. Adante, that's a different element to this story. How do you think it affects the current charges he's facing with respect to the officer? I mean, will it? Is it two separate cases? It won't have an effect?
At this point, the previous case for DWI is just a charge. He hasn't been convicted, although the judge can take that into consideration when determining whether or not to set bail or to allow him to once again go free on his own recognizance. However, as it relates to the criminal prosecution, the DA could look to that as more evidence of the fact that this is a person who was unhinged or unable to control himself and or may have been under the influence of alcohol or drugs in the previous incident and in the current incident. Of course, the attorneys are going to spar over that, whether or not that evidence or that charge should be excluded from the charge of running over or attempting to run over this police officer. So that's going to be hotly contested during the course of this prosecution. And if by chance the judge allows that evidence in as it relates to the prior DWI, that may be something that weighs heavily on the jury's mind if this case should get that far.
And by the way, we don't have evidence of this, but just want to clear any, moment of doubt here. If, for assumption's sake, he was intoxicated when this happened, and let's say he allegedly did do this, I know intoxication, voluntary intoxication, is not a defense. However, is it an element that could mitigate the attempted murder charge in any way? I mean, again, just for assumption's sake, we don't know the circumstances, all this. I'm not saying he was intoxicated, but I just want to theorize this for a second. If he was intoxicated, could that mitigate it, reduce it from an attempted murder charge to, just focus on the assault charges? You tell me.
The idea that he may have potentially been intoxicated during this incident would weigh in terms of how the prosecution wants to proceed. And I don't think it necessarily weighs in if it should get to a jury trial, because voluntary intoxication doesn't negate the activity or the conduct that he engaged in. However, when it comes down to plea deal negotiations, a prosecutor could certainly take that into consideration in terms of what type of deal is reached between the defendant and the prosecution, because they could say that's a mitigating circumstance. Essentially, Conover doesn't behave in this manner on most occasions, but he's going through a mental health crisis. He may have been under the influence of something, and that is something that they can take into consideration as it relates to reaching a deal for a lesser included charge like the battery or assault on an officer versus the attempted murder charge as it currently stands.
I appreciate that. That's an interesting perspective about that. All right, well, look, for now, Mr. Conover is being held on preventative detention. He's due back in New Hampshire court next week for a probable cause hearing, basically to see, is there enough evidence to move this case forward? So, interesting development. Adante Pointer, thanks so much for coming back here on Sidebar. Appreciate it. Good seeing you.
Always love being here. Talk to you till the next time.
All right, everybody, that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, come check us out and please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.